Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're talking about one of the most pivotal years in American history, the year 1676. In the previous lecture, we talked about King Philip's War, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about another pivotal event from that year, Bacon's Rebellion. Now, all of this, again, is a discussion of the general upheaval that characterized the colonial era. So Bacon's Rebellion really is rooted in two of the primary conflicts that existed in colonial Virginia at that time. One was conflict between the English settlers and Indians at the frontier. The other was an internal conflict between new migrants versus older, well-established settlers. So we've talked previously about some of the conflict between English settlers and Indians in the Virginia colony. The two sides fought sporadically until 1646, when they agreed on a treaty dividing the land between them. The Indians retreated back across that established line, and the settlers did not cross it, at least for a time. By the 1660s and 70s, though, the line was causing tension on both sides, and increasingly representatives on either side crossed that line. So there's conflict between the Indians and the settlers. There is also this internal conflict between newer arrivals and those who had been in the colonies for some time. Many of the recent arrivals were indentured servants. And we're going to be talking about indentured servants more in the next chapter. But recall that they were folks who had essentially sold themselves for a time in order to pay for their passage to arrive in the Americas. So, they arrive, they now have to work for someone else, and even after serving their time, many of them find that there's no land for them. They're kind of left without upward opportunity. One scholar has described this growing group well. They were poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. And that is a volatile combination. There were other newer arrivals coming from England who were not indentured servants but were sons of gentry and who expected positions of influence, power, and perhaps wealth even after their arrivals. Our man in question, Nathaniel Bacon, is one of those. So this is not a class conflict. Bacon is not poor. This is a power conflict. He arrives in the early 1670s as a 29-year-old planter with money and ambition and the expectation of some position of status within Virginian society. Now these two conflicts come to a head in this Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. It begins with a small incident. So many things in history begin with something small that might have been forgotten, but it quickly escalated. A group of friendly Indians who were called the Doegs felt they had been shortchanged in a trade with one of the local settlers. And to recompense for that, they stole some hogs from that settler. The settler responded by murdering one of the Indians. The sides exchanged increasingly large attacks until outright war threatened. So this is the volatile situation on the fringes of the Virginia settlement. So Nathaniel Bacon, this relatively new arrival, organizes a group of like-minded frontiersmen and goes on a rampage, slaughtering Indians indiscriminately. Some were hostile to the settlers. Others had signed treaties or were even friendly to the settlers. Bacon didn't care. He slaughtered any Indians he could find. Bacon appealed to the governor of Virginia at that time, whose name was William Berkeley, for a militia to assist him in these attacks on the Indians. Berkeley refuses to endorse Bacon, and in fact tries to have Bacon arrested. The conflict between Bacon and Berkeley then escalates and takes center stage in Bacon's Rebellion. So this is another sort of conflict that some scholars have referred to as court country, or it's a sort of insider-outsider conflict. Berkeley was well established, and his family had been in the Americas for decades. Bacon is a newer arrival, trying to forge his way into power and influence. Bacon was the son of an aristocrat who had come from England already with a fair measure of money and status. He was a cavalier, and yet he found himself only on the fringes of power. This relates to another factor. William Berkeley, according to the laws of that time, had a civil list of perks and offices that he could assign. We would call this patronage today. Who would he choose to fill the offices around him? Well, of course, he always chose old Virginia aristocrats, those who were friends of him and his family, this group of cronies. And so not only Nathaniel Bacon, but many others like him, this newer gentry that had arrived, they all found themselves on the outskirts of power, and it rankled with them. And so, the escalating conflict with the Indians gave Bacon an opportunity to have it out with the governor, and he leapt at the chance. Bacon raised an army of his own, which we see here, a combination of frustrated indentured servants and others of this court-country conflict, the sort of outsiders. Bacon's militia defeated Berkeley and his militia. Bacon then raided Jamestown, burned the city, ousted the governor, and took control of the colony. Now, this could have wound up as a major shift in the power balance in the colonies, had not Nathaniel Bacon taken ill not long after this and died. His supporters are then factionalized and broken up, and order is restored. So, Bacon does not manage to seize power. Nonetheless, we have this dramatic episode that highlights so many of the conflicts within the colonies at that time. So what are the results of Bacon's rebellion? Well, as we saw with King Philip's War, it ended peaceful relations with the Indians in this area, and actually allowed for further expansion of the settlement. The ruling clique, in the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, recognizes the need to include this newer generation, and thus the civil list is expanded beyond just those of the old power structure. It's expanded to include people like Bacon and those around him. It also inspired other rebellions in other areas. In New York, in Maryland, in the Carolinas, broadly speaking across the colonies, we begin to see a reordering of society that includes some of those newer arrivals in the power structure. And a final, extremely important outcome of Bacon's rebellion is that it provides a powerful incentive for those in power to turn away from indentured servitude and, in fact, rely more on African slavery. For a couple of different reasons. African slaves are easier to identify. Should there be any problem, should there be some sort of rebellion like we've seen in Bacon's rebellion, indentured servants blend right into the population, but African slaves are readily identified. But more than that, African slaves provided a labor force that would have no expectations of equality, and they wouldn't agitate for change, and most importantly, they would not be armed. And we're going to talk much more about the transition to African slavery as we get into discussions in the next chapter. For our final part of the discussion of the colonial era in this chapter, in our next lesson, we're going to talk about the Salem witch trials.